Good morning, everyone. Glad to have you here with us today. My name is Dennis Morrison. I'm the minister for the Church of Christ in Jefferson, Texas. We're going to be in John chapter 8, and remember now, there are many different views that people have concerning the Christ, as we've already studied. Some believe he is the Son of God. Others, of course, were kind of in doubt, and yet the religious leaders of the day hated Jesus. They envied him, and because of that, we find then that they wanted to take him and kill him. Well, they were looking for opportunity against him. Matter of fact, because of all of the indecision that the Jews had about Jesus, the leaders thought that this would be a good time for them to go and to take Jesus. And yet the officers they sent to take him came back and said, "Never a man spake like this man spake." But this, of course, did not stop the Jewish leaders from trying to look for opportunity against him. We find here in John chapter 8 that it says, Jesus went unto the Mount of Olives. And so he goes out to the Mount of Olives, and oftentimes you'll find that this is where Jesus and his disciples would go, and they would seek sanctuary there from their busy schedule that they had with him preaching and teaching. And yet we find in verse 2 it says, "And early in the morning he came again into the temple, and all the people came unto him, and he sat down and he taught them." And so it's interesting that the people still yet come to hear what Jesus has to say. And as a result of that, think about the fact that these people are learning more and more and more about Jesus. And then, of course, seeing the miracles that Jesus had done in the past, and even the things that he will do, that this would be the evidence that would help them to believe that he is the Son of God, just as John states as we continue in our study at the latter end of the book. Well, here is Jesus in the temple teaching the people, and yet we find that it says in verse 3, "And the scribes and Pharisees brought unto him a woman taken in adultery, and when they had set her in the midst, they said unto him, Master, this woman was taken in adultery, in the very act. Now Moses in the law commanded us that such should be stoned. But what sayest thou?" And so here we have the scribes and the Pharisees thinking that they got Jesus between a rock and a hard place, and yet they don't know who they're dealing with. They're dealing with the very Son of God. And of course, he was the one through whom God gave the law unto Moses. And now we find that he is here being questioned about the law of Moses and the things that God had commanded. Well, we realize that according to the old law, that individuals who were taken in adultery were to be stoned to death. You find that back in Leviticus chapter 20 and verse 11, Deuteronomy chapter 22 and verse 22. And so what is Jesus going to say here? Well, how is he going to deal with this particular situation? Well, we have to understand something, that the Jews that brought this woman, the scribes and the Pharisees that brought this woman, Jesus knew their heart. He knew why they had done this. And it was not for them, to keep the law. That was not their purpose. Their purpose was to entrap Jesus and to use this against him. And Jesus, knowing their heart then, gave them an answer that pretty much surprised them, but it was an answer that helped them to realize exactly where their heart was. And because of that, they turned away and did not stone the woman. But now let's think a little bit about what has been said already concerning this situation. Here they bring this woman. She was caught, in their words, in the very act of adultery. Now, if that's the case, the man was also caught in the very act of adultery. The question comes to mind, where is the man? The man also was to be brought. The man also, if he had done this deed, was to be stoned to death. And yet we find that he was not there. Was this an entrapment? Was this something that the Jews did to entrap this woman so that they then would have an opportunity to say something contrary to Jesus and to say that he's not the Son of God and that no one should listen to him? We would hope that someone would not go to that kind of an extreme. And even though we're not told that they were going to that kind of an extreme, we do know that if these two were caught in the very act of adultery, that the man should have been brought as well. Therefore, because of this, we see that the heart of the scribes and the Pharisees here were not right in the sight of God, and they were doing this out of envy and out of hate. They were not doing this to keep the law. They were not having the, as the Old Testament would say, the heart of mercy towards someone in their actions here. Well, as you go on, you'll find that it says the reason why they were doing this, in verse 6, they said this for what reason? Tempting him, that they might have to accuse him. But Jesus stooped down and with his finger wrote on the ground. You know, we oftentimes wonder what it was that Jesus wrote on the ground. But here you are, if you're one of those Jews, you're seeing Jesus not really forcefully giving an answer to what was going on here, and yet he sat down and he wrote something on the ground. Well, notice it continues in verse 7, so when they continued asking him, he lifted up himself and said unto them, he that is without sin among you, let him first cast a stone at her. Now, I know a lot of times we, in a very general way, say that Jesus is saying that we all have sin. Of course, Jesus had no sin because he's the Son of God, and he was tempted in all forms as we are, yet without sin. But here we have something that is more specific. I understand in connection with us all having sin, and that we got to be very careful the way we judge other individuals. We need to judge individuals according to righteous judgment. We don't need to be hypocritical in our judgment. We don't need to be involved in sin and condemn somebody else for the sins that they are involved in. And this, of course, is the case that we have right here. These Jews were giving judgment, but it was unjust judgment. It was not righteous judgment. Righteous judgment would have been in connection with the law, and yet their heart was not right. And so they ask him this, they keep on pressing him, and so Jesus, of course, finally answers them there in verse 7. And you can go back over to Deuteronomy chapter 17 and verse 7 and see why Jesus would give such an answer. Now, let's think a little bit about this, because he wrote on the ground, he then answered them, and then he did what? Stooped down again and wrote on the ground. Okay, so once again, he's done this twice. We don't know what he wrote, but undoubtedly what it was that he did write pierced their hearts. And not only that, but also the words that he spake pierced their heart, because now they know that Jesus knows that they're not doing what they're doing with the proper motivation in mind. Okay, they were not doing this to carry the law out as God would intend. They're doing this because of their hatred and their envy of the Christ. Now, notice the reaction here in verse 9, and this is the reason why I know these individuals, number one, had the wrong intention, because they were doing this to tempt Jesus to have something to say against him. But notice what happens. They did not continue to press Jesus saying, hey, you need to do what the law says. You need to fulfill the law. Because Jesus had pricked their hearts. He let them know, I know why you're doing this. You're not doing this to carry out the law. You're doing this because of your hatred toward me. Going on, notice in verse 9 it says, and they which heard it, what Jesus has said, ye who are without sin, you go ahead and you cast the first stone. So when they heard it, being convicted by their own conscience, see, they knew why they were doing this, not to do what the law said, but to do something against the Christ, to try to hurt him in some way. Notice it says that they were convicted by their own conscience, went out one by one, beginning at the eldest, even unto the last, and Jesus was left alone, and the woman standing in the midst. Now, it's interesting that as Jesus said this, and they started thinking about what he said, and their consciences being pricked, we find what? That they start leaving. And you see that what? You see that the eldest are the ones that start leaving first, because they can see that they're wrong. But as you go on down the line, you find the younger ones that are still there with stones in their hands, and you kind of wonder, well, why are they still there? Well, that youth, kind of being hot-headed when it came to things like this, it took them a little bit longer for them to be persuaded that they shouldn't do it. But could you imagine following these leaders to do what they were wanting to do and trying to entrap Jesus, and then you see your leaders leaving, and then eventually you say, well, I'm just going to leave too, because I know that if they realized they were wrong in what they wanted to do, that I would be wrong as well. And so now all of them have left, and as a result, you find Jesus standing here with the woman. Notice what took place in verse 10. When Jesus had lifted up himself, that is, he was stooped down, and now he lifts himself up and stands there with the woman. And so when Jesus lifted himself up and saw none but the woman, he said unto her, Woman, where are those that accuse thee? Hath no man condemned thee? And she said, No man, Lord. And Jesus said unto her, Neither do I condemn thee. Go and sin no more. Now, of course, we need to understand what Jesus is saying here. Jesus is not saying that he condoned adultery, because we find that Jesus himself tells us that adultery is something that is contrary to the Old Testament law, and it's also contrary to what is taught in the New Testament. So what exactly is Jesus saying here then when he tells her that he does not condemn her, go and sin no more? Well, number one, the recognition of the fact that she sinned is evident. Number two, Jesus, while he was here on earth, could speak a person's sins forgiven. He could forgive sins in any way he wanted to forgive sins. Remember, we've already talked about how that Jesus told the lame man to take up his bed and walk. And people were saying, well, why didn't you say something different? Why didn't you say something else or do something different? Well, of course, Jesus said, well, which is easier to say, take up your bed and walk, or thy sins be forgiven thee? But to prove that Jesus had the power to forgive sins on earth, thus he told the man, what? Thy sins be forgiven thee. And so this was about Jesus forgiving this woman. She was in sin, that's true. But now we find that Jesus standing there with her, realizing that no one was there to condemn her, he forgave her and told her to sin no more. And so here we have, I think, a very touching situation in the life of Christ because of the way people treated this woman. And yet Jesus showed mercy unto her. He, of course, was willing to forgive her, and he encouraged her not to go back in to that kind of sin. And so it teaches us a lot about Jesus. It also teaches us a lot about this woman who realizes her need to change her life. It teaches us a lesson about the Jewish leaders of the day and the extent to which they would go to try to condemn the Christ. And so I think there's a lot of lessons that we can learn from what we've been talking about in connection with Jesus. And so once again, Jesus said, Neither do I condemn thee, go and sin no more. We can be forgiven by the Christ if we will simply turn away from sin and come to him. Jesus said in Mark chapter 16 and verse 16, He that believes and is baptized shall be saved. He that believes not shall be damned. We can be forgiven of our sins. We just need to make sure that we have the right heart to act upon those things that God tells us to do, to turn away from sin and to turn to him through obedience unto the things that he says. Well, we appreciate y'all joining in today, and hopefully this was a lesson that was beneficial, and it helps us to understand the need for mercy. We need mercy, and we need to be willing to show mercy as well. And as a result, we will be able to help others that they might be able to come to God. Well, thanks once again, and y'all take care and have a blessed day.